The fall. The crash came without warning. One moment, the colony transport ship Hope's Horizon was gliding through the silent void of space, and the next it was a fiery wreck spiraling toward the surface of Xelvoria Prime, a world known only in scattered records as a death trap. Reports described it as a wasteland of mountains, storms, and dragons. Not the kind of dragons from Earth's myths, but something far worse. Towering reptilian beasts, some as large as warships, with obsidian armor like scales and a mindless hunger for destruction. No one from the United Terran Federation had ever returned from the planet. They were never supposed to be here, but 8-year-old Sarah Williams wasn't given a choice. She had no idea what had caused the ship to fail. Maybe an asteroid field, maybe an attack, maybe a simple engine malfunction. None of that mattered as she was thrown from her sleep pod, tumbling through chaos, her tiny hands trying to grab onto something, anything, to stop the world from spinning. Then came the explosion. She barely remembered the moment the hull was torn apart, metal shrieking and bodies being sucked into the abyss. Alarms blared, red emergency lights flickered. She remembered screaming, calling for her parents, for the ship's captain, for anyone, but no one answered. Then a flash of light, blinding, searing, an inferno consuming her vision, before silence. A deep, crushing silence. Awakening in hell. Sarah woke to pain. Her body ached. Her head throbbed. There was a metallic taste in her mouth. Blood. She lay on her back, staring at the sky, blinking away the fog in her vision. Above her, dark storm clouds swirled, occasionally split apart by eerie flashes of violet lightning. The sky was thick with ash, the air heavy with the scent of sulfur and decay. She moved, groaning, and felt the cold press of stone and dirt beneath her fingers. Her small body was half buried in debris, a few charred pieces of metal and broken ship components scattered around her. She tried to sit up. Pain flared in her ribs. Broken? Maybe. She didn't know, but she forced herself upright anyway, gasping at the sight before her. The wreckage of the Hope's Horizon lay in ruins across the jagged terrain, half buried in blackened mountains. The hull was split apart, burning wreckage sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. And there were no voices, no cries for help, no survivors. Sarah's breath hitched, panic rising in her throat. She was alone, the watchers in the dark. Then she heard them, a deep, rumbling growl from somewhere beyond the wreckage. Another, and another. Her heart pounded. She turned her head slowly, so slowly it felt like time had frozen. And that's when she saw them. Dark figures moved along the ridges of the mountains, their massive forms shifting through the mist and smoke. Dragons. The largest one stood atop the wreckage, its obsidian black scales glistening beneath the flickering light of the burning debris. Molten red eyes burned into her as it lowered its head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Sarah froze, ran. The thoughts screamed in her mind. Every instinct told her to move, to hide, to do anything but sit there like prey. But her body wouldn't listen. The dragon took a step forward, its razor-sharp claws sinking into the metal remains of the ship. The ground shuddered beneath its weight. Then the others followed. From the shadows they emerged, smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. They were different shades. Some had deep crimson scales, others a sickly gray. 5 of them. Their serrated teeth glistened as they stalked closer, their tails whipped behind them, carving deep scars into the rock. The largest dragon, the leader, let out a low, guttural growl. The others responded with hissing snarls, but they did not attack. They circled her, studying. Seer clenched her fists. If they wanted to kill her, they would have done it already. Then why weren't they attacking? The Alpha's choice. The Alpha dragon lowered its head further, now only a few feet from her. its molten eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, just a moment, Sarah thought she saw something other than hunger. Curiosity. Her breath caught. The dragon exhaled, a blast of hot air rushing over her. The stench of sulfur and fire burned her nose, but she held still, refusing to look away. A strange feeling washed over her, like something deep inside her recognized this creature. And then it did the impossible. It turned its head slightly and let out a deep, resonant sound. Not a growl, not a snarl, but something else. A sound that almost felt like a question. The other dragons tensed, waiting. Sarah swallowed hard. She knew she was about to die. But if this was how she was going to go, she raised a trembling hand and placed it against the alpha's muzzle. The world stopped. The other dragons hissed in alarm, their tails thrashing, but the alpha did not move. It just stared at her. Something deep and ancient shifted between them. Then the massive dragon made its choice. With a final snort, it turned its head sharply toward the others. And then it roared. A thunderous, earth-shaking roar that echoed across the mountains. The smaller dragons bowed their heads immediately, their bodies trembling. A few seconds later, they all turned and left. One by one, they disappeared into the dark. The alpha remained. It lowered itself slightly, its head still tilted toward her, as if waiting. Waiting for her, a new fate. Sarah's mind spun. It didn't kill me. It's not leaving. A terrifying thought dawned on her. This isn't a monster. This is a king. And it just claimed her. For the first time since she crashed, Sarah let out a shaking breath. Then she took a step forward, and the dragon didn't stop her. With one last glance at the burning wreckage of her old life, she placed a hand on the beast's obsidian scales. The dragon huffed, then turned. It began to walk, and Sarah followed. The little girl who should have died among dragons was now one of them. A kingdom of monsters. The journey was long, brutal, and silent. Sarah didn't know how much time passed as she followed the massive dragon through the endless wasteland of Xelvoria Prime. Days and nights blurred together. Her legs ached, her ribs throbbed with pain, but she kept walking. The alpha dragon, the one that had spared her, never looked back. It didn't wait for her, it simply moved, and if she couldn't keep up, she'd be left behind. That much was clear. The landscape around her was a graveyard of giants. Jagged obsidian mountains stabbed into the sky, their tips glowing with molten veins. Rivers of lava snaked between cracked earth, their bubbling surfaces releasing bursts of toxic steam. Scattered across the land were bones, some so large they looked like they belonged to creatures even bigger than the dragons. And yet this was not a wasteland. It was a kingdom. Because beyond the mountains, past the smoldering ruins and dead valleys, Sarah saw them. Dragons. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Some rested atop stone perches, their massive wings curled around their bodies like living fortresses. Others soared through the sky, silhouetted against storm clouds, their bodies cutting through the ash and fire as if they were part of it. The air trembled with their roars, their deep guttural calls shaking the earth itself. Sarah's breath hitched. This wasn't just their home. This was their empire, and she had just walked into it. A test of strength. The alpha dragon led her to a massive plateau, an elevated throne of rock surrounded by a deep chasm of lava. It was connected to the mainland by a single narrow stone bridge, barely wide enough for a full-grown dragon. And waiting there, perched atop the highest peak, was something terrifying. A dragon bigger than all the others. Its scales were a deep iridescent violet, shifting between hues of black and blue under the light of the molten rivers below. Its wings stretched wider than any beast Sira had ever seen, and when it lifted its head, its eyes, glowing silver, locked onto hers. The alpha dragon beside her lowered its head, letting out a slow, rumbling growl. The violet dragon responded with a deafening roar, a sound that sent tremors through the ground beneath her feet. Sarah flinched. She could feel their conversation, though she didn't understand their words. The violet dragon was their leader, their true king, and the alpha that had claimed her was asking for something, pleading even. Sarah's heart pounded. What was going on? The king of dragons watched her for a long moment. Then it growled, and the other dragons roared in response. Sarah didn't need to know their language to understand. This was a test, a trial. The Violet King stepped back, and from the shadows, 3 dragons emerged. Challengers. They were smaller than the alpha, but still larger than any creature Sarah had ever seen. Their eyes burned with hunger, their claws scraped against the stone, their tails lashed the air like whips. And they were looking directly at her. Sarah stiffened. This wasn't an execution. It was a fight. Her mind reeled. She was just a child, a weak, starving, fragile child. She couldn't possibly. The alpha dragon growled sharply. Sarah's breath caught. She understood. If she could not fight, she would die. The hunger for survival. Sarah had no weapons, no armor, nothing. But she had survived this long, and she wasn't going to die now. The first dragon lunged. She dove sideways, just barely avoiding the crushing weight of its clawed foot as it slammed into the ground where she had been standing. The second dragon attacked before she could recover, its tail sweeping toward her like a razor-edged battering ram. She had no time to think. She jumped. The tail ripped through the ground, sending a shockwave of cracked stone across the plateau. Sarah landed hard, rolling across the dirt, her ribs screaming in pain. Too slow, too weak. She was going to die. Then she heard the alpha, a deep, powerful growl cutting through the chaos. Her eyes snapped to it, and for a split second she understood. This wasn't a mindless battle. This was a game of dominance. The alpha was watching, and so was the Violet King. Sarah clenched her fists. They were waiting for her to prove herself. She had to fight, not with strength, but with intelligence. The third dragon lunged, jaws wide, going straight for her throat. Sarah did something insane. She ran toward it. The dragon's eyes widened. It hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, confused by her stupidity. That was all she needed. At the last second, she dropped low, sliding beneath the dragon's gaping maw. The beast choked in surprise as she darted under its head, then leapt onto its back. She grabbed onto its spines with all the strength she had left. The dragon shrieked, thrashing wildly, trying to shake her off. But she held on, with everything she had. She could feel its heart pounding beneath her hands. She could feel its breath, fast and sharp, shuddering in confusion. And that's when she understood. The dragons weren't trying to kill her. They were trying to see if she could control them. A test of dominance. Sarah gritted her teeth, adjusting her grip. And then she did something insane. She snarled, a low guttural sound, a pathetic imitation of the dragon's language. But the beast below her froze. Its instincts screamed at it, telling it to obey, to submit. The moment stretched, endless, frozen in time. Then, slowly, reluctantly, the dragon lowered itself. Sarah did not let go. She knew what would happen next. She turned her head, locking eyes with the Violet King. The beast stared back at her. Then, in a voice like a storm tearing through the sky, the dragon let out a roar of approval. The alpha dragon roared in response. The other dragons, All of them bowed their heads. And just like that, Sarah was no longer prey. She was one of them. No, she was something more. She was their queen. The throne of beasts. Sarah wasn't ready to be a queen. She was still just a child, a weak, starving little girl, barely clinging to life, with no kingdom, no army, no crown. And yet the dragons bowed. The Violet King, the oldest and most powerful of them all, had accepted her, and in the eyes of these monsters, that made her something greater. Her trial of fire was over, but her real battle was just beginning. The laws of the wild. Sarah sat on a massive slab of blackened stone, a natural throne carved by time and lava, watching as the dragons moved around her. Some perched along the mountain peaks, their glowing eyes never leaving her. Others remained on the ground, shifting restlessly, claws scraping against the stone. They were waiting, watching, testing. She was not one of them yet. Not truly. Not until she understood the laws of this place. The Violet King, a dragon so ancient that its scales looked as if they had been forged in the heart of a dying star, moved forward. Sarah held her breath. Every movement it made was deliberate, its massive wings barely shifting as it lowered its head toward her. A silent command. Listen, learn, serve. And so she did. Lesson 1. The strong rule, the weak perish. Xelvoria Prime had no mercy. There was no safety, no sanctuary. If a dragon could not hunt, could not fight, could not conquer, it was left to die. And for a human child, the law was no different. The dragons would not feed her, would not protect her, would not carry her on their backs like some fragile little thing. She had to prove she could hunt, or she would starve. That first night, Sarah curled up in the cold, her stomach screaming for food, her ribs aching from exhaustion. The dragons did not comfort her. They simply watched, waiting to see if she would break. She didn't. At dawn, she rose, and she followed them into the wilderness. Lesson 2. The hunt is sacred. The sky burned red with the light of twin suns as Sarah crouched behind a jagged boulder, her hands shaking. Before her, the prey moved, an enormous four-legged beast covered in thick lava-colored hide, its tusks curved like scythes. A Varick beast, one of the few creatures on Xelvoria that the dragons actually hunted for food. And today, she was going to kill one, not because she wanted to, because she had to. The dragons circled above, silent shadows against the sky, but they did not attack. This was her hunt, her first test. She gritted her teeth. She had no weapons. No claws, no fangs, no scales to shield her. But she had her mind. She moved slowly, testing the wind, remembering what she had seen the dragons do. She studied the Varick's movements, the way it twitched its ears, the way its muscles tensed before it turned. And then she saw it. A weakness. The thick plates along its spine ended just below the skull. An exposed spot. A killing point. Her heart pounded. She had no blade, no spear, no gun. But she had a rock, a jagged piece of obsidian sharpened by the fury of the planet itself. She clenched it in her hands, and then she ran. The Varick roared in surprise as she sprinted toward it, too fast for it to react. She leapt and drove the rock into its neck. The beast screamed, its massive body thrashing, its tusks carving deep trenches in the earth. Sarah held on. She pressed harder. Hot blood spilled over her hands, coating her arms, her face. Her vision blurred. Her muscles screamed. But she didn't let go. And then, the Varick collapsed. Dead. The ground trembled as the dragons landed. Their eyes burned into her, their nostrils flaring as they sniffed the scent of blood. Then the Violet King let out a deep, approving growl, and the others joined him, a chorus of roars shaking the heavens. She had passed. That night she ate with them, not as a pet, not as a prisoner, but as one of their own. Lesson 3: The Queen Must Lead. Months passed. Sarah grew stronger. She learned to read the land, to sense the storms before they arrived. She learned the language of the dragons, the way their growls and body movements formed a silent code. And more than anything, she learned to lead. It started with the hunts. At first, she followed. Then, she began directing the younger dragons, leading them into ambush positions, timing their strikes perfectly. She watched them respond to her. She saw how they listened, and she realized the truth. The dragons were not mindless beasts. They were a society, and in their ancient, brutal hierarchy, the strongest mind ruled, not just the strongest body. That was why the Violet King had accepted her, because even though she was small, she was different. And different meant powerful. The challenge. Not everyone agreed with the king's decision. There were others who resented her. Older dragons, strong warriors. They saw her as an intruder. And when the Violet King weakened, when its age finally began to slow its movements, they made their move. A challenge. The alpha dragons of the different clans gathered in the heart of their territory, a massive canyon where battles had been fought for thousands of years. And there, a rival rose, a massive black-scaled beast, its body covered in battle scars, its wings tattered from countless wars. It stepped forward and let out a roar of defiance. It wanted the throne. It wanted Sarah dead. She felt the Violet King's gaze on her. It was her choice. Flee or fight. Sarah clenched her fists. She would not run. She turned to the rival and took a step forward. The dragons roared in approval. The challenge had been accepted. The battle for the throne of fire had begun. The call of the ancients. The canyon was silent, not the silence of peace, the silence before war. Sarah stood in the center of the pit, her bare feet pressing against the blackened stone, still warm from the last rays of sunlight. Above her, the Violet King rested atop a jagged perch, its silver eyes unreadable as it watched. The other dragons had gathered around the battlefield, hundreds perched along the canyon walls, their glowing eyes like stars burning in the darkness. And at the far end of the pit, her challenger waited. It was massive, even larger than the alpha dragon that had once spared her. Scars ran along its obsidian scales, trophies of battles fought long before Sarah had ever set foot on this world. Its wings were jagged, torn from wars with creatures even it had struggled to kill. Its eyes, deep, molten orange, locked onto hers. And in that moment, she understood. This was not just a battle. This was an execution, a reminder that no matter how much she had learned, how strong she had become, she was still only human, still a fragile little thing in a world of monsters. And yet, she was not afraid, because she had survived this world. She had hunted among them. She had fought beside them. And now, she would rule them. The Duel of Kings. The black-scaled challenger moved first. A flash of obsidian wings, and then, it was on her. The ground shook as it slammed down, its claws carving through the stone, its jaws snapping toward her throat. Sarah dodged left, barely avoiding death. Too fast. Too strong. If she fought like a human, she would die. So she didn't. The surgery, she fought like them. The dragon lunged again, a brutal, crushing strike aimed to end her in a single blow. Instead of retreating, she ran toward it. At the last second, she dropped low, sliding beneath its massive body. The heat of its scales burned against her skin, but she ignored it. And then she struck. Her hands found the jagged ridges along its underbelly, the only weak point beneath its armor. She climbed. The dragon roared in fury, its body thrashing, its wings beating the air in an attempt to shake her loose. But she held on. She dug her fingers between the thickest plates of its spine, her heart pounding, her breaths ragged. She had one chance, one moment. One mistake meant death. She pulled herself forward, forcing the dragon's head back. And then she did the impossible. She roared. Not a scream, not a cry. A dragon's roar. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The canyon shook with the force of her defiance. The other dragons stirred, their eyes flickering with something she hadn't seen before. Recognition. The black-scaled challenger hesitated. It didn't understand. It didn't know what she was. And that was its mistake. She leaned forward, pressing her hand against the base of its skull, and willed it to submit. The creature shuddered. It fought, it resisted, its entire body rejecting the idea of surrender. But its instincts screamed otherwise. Sarah could feel it. The way its muscles twitched, its breath grew uneven. It knew. The others knew. She was not prey. She was not an outsider. She was their queen. The black-scaled dragon fell to its knees. The canyon erupted in roars, not of war, of submission. The fire-born queen. Sarah slid down from the beast's back, her legs shaking, her arms burning from exhaustion. The Violet King watched her, and then slowly it lowered its head. A bow. One by one, the others followed. The alphas, the warriors, the hunters, even the ones she had defeated. They all bowed. A moment stretched, silent, eternal, unbreakable. And then the Violet King let out a roar. A proclamation, a declaration. And in that moment, Sarah was no longer human. She was theirs. A child of fire, a queen of dragons, and Xelvoria Prime would never be the same. Epilogue. The sky belongs to her. Years passed.
Sarah grew.
The weak, starving child was gone. In her place stood a warrior.
A ruler.
The dragons no longer saw her as a human. She was one of them. And when the United Terran Federation finally returned, when their warships descended from the sky, expecting to reclaim the girl they had lost, they found something else waiting for them. Not a victim, not a survivor, a queen, standing atop the back of the greatest dragon the world had ever known. Her golden eyes burned with the fire of the world that had remade her, and as she raised her hand, the dragons took flight.
Xelvoria was hers.
And she would never kneel again.